The morning sun filtered through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Victoria Sterling sat motionless in her wheelchair, staring out at the sprawling gardens she once ran through as a child. Her fingers, pale and thin from months of inactivity, rested limply on the armrests of her custom-made wheelchair. At 22, she had the defeated posture of someone much older, someone who had given up on life itself. The accident had happened 8 months ago. A skiing trip in the Swiss Alps with her college friends had turned into a nightmare when an avalanche caught their group off guard. While her friends escaped with minor injuries, Victoria's spine had been crushed by falling ice and debris. The doctors delivered the devastating news with clinical precision: complete paralysis from the waist down. No chance of recovery. Her life as she knew it was over. "Victoria, darling, you need to eat something," her mother, Eleanor Sterling, said as she entered the sun-drenched breakfast room. Eleanor was the picture of old money elegance, her silver hair perfectly styled, her posture straight despite carrying the weight of watching her daughter fade away. She carried a tray with fresh fruit and toast, foods that Victoria barely touched anymore. Victoria didn't respond. She hadn't spoken more than a few words in weeks. The physical therapy sessions had stopped when she refused to participate. The counseling sessions ended when she wouldn't engage with the therapists. Even her closest friends had gradually stopped visiting, unable to handle the darkness that seemed to surround her now. "The new physical therapist is coming today," Eleanor continued, setting the tray on the small table beside Victoria's wheelchair. "Dr. Morrison says she comes highly recommended. She's worked with many patients who have made remarkable progress." Victoria finally turned her head, her green eyes dull and lifeless. "Mother, please stop. We both know nothing is going to change. I'm never going to walk again. I'm never going to dance again. I'm never going to have a normal life. Why can't everyone just accept that?" Eleanor's heart broke a little more each time she heard the defeat in her daughter's voice. Victoria had been such a vibrant young woman before the accident. She had been studying international business, planning to work alongside her father in their global enterprises. She loved horseback riding, tennis, and had been an accomplished ballet dancer since childhood. Now, she was a shadow of her former self. "Don't say that, sweetheart. You're still the same brilliant, beautiful girl you've always been. Your body may have changed, but your spirit—" "My spirit is broken, Mother," Victoria interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And no amount of money or therapy is going to fix that." Eleanor squeezed her daughter's shoulder gently before leaving her alone. Victoria returned her gaze to the window, watching the gardeners tend to the rose bushes her grandmother had planted decades ago. She wondered if she would spend the rest of her life watching other people live their lives while she remained trapped in this chair. Later that morning, Victoria heard unfamiliar voices in the hallway. Her parents were talking to someone new, their voices carrying the forced optimism they always used when discussing her care. She closed her eyes and pretended to sleep, hoping whoever it was would leave her alone. "Miss Victoria," a gentle voice said from the doorway. The accent was warm and musical, different from the crisp tones of the previous therapists and nurses who had tried to help her. Victoria opened her eyes reluctantly and saw a woman standing in the doorway. She appeared to be in her 40s, with kind brown eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore simple clothes, a clean white blouse and dark slacks, and carried a small bag. There was something immediately calming about her presence. "I'm Grace Washington," the woman said, stepping into the room. "Your parents asked me to meet you. If you're another physical therapist, you can leave now," Victoria said flatly. "I'm not interested in false hope or miracle cures." Grace smiled gently and pulled a chair closer to Victoria's wheelchair. "I'm not a physical therapist. I'm here to help with daily care and companionship. Your mother thought you might benefit from having someone around who isn't trying to fix you." Victoria was surprised by this honesty. Most people who came to help her spoke in euphemisms and empty encouragement. "So you're a maid," she said, not unkindly but matter-of-factly.
I'm right here with
"I
you.
prefer caregiver," Grace replied with a slight smile. "Though I do know my way around a house. I've been caring for people for over 20 years. Some needed help with physical tasks, others just needed someone to listen." "Well, I don't need either," Victoria said, turning back toward the window. "I just want to be left alone." Grace sat quietly for a moment, not trying to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. Finally, she spoke. You know, I had a daughter once. Her name was Sarah. She was about your age when she died in a car accident. Victoria's attention was caught despite herself. She had expected platitudes about staying positive, not a personal revelation. I'm sorry, Victoria said, her voice softer. Thank you, Grace replied. After Sarah died, I didn't want to go on either. I stayed in bed for months, barely eating, pushing away everyone who tried to help. I thought my life was over because the future I had planned with her was gone. Victoria turned to look at Grace more fully. There was genuine pain in the older woman's eyes, but also something else, a quiet strength that Victoria hadn't seen in the faces of others who had tried to help her. What changed? Victoria found herself asking. One day, a neighbor's little boy came to my door. He was maybe 6 years old, and his grandmother who took care of him had fallen ill. He was hungry and scared, and he asked if I had any food. I was so focused on my own pain that I had forgotten there were others in the world who were hurting too. Grace paused, looking out the window at the same gardens Victoria had been watching. Helping that little boy reminded me that even when our own lives feel impossible, we can still make a difference in someone else's life. Victoria considered this. But that's different. You could still walk, still take care of yourself. You weren't useless. Useless. Grace turned to face Victoria directly. Child, you think because your legs don't work, the rest of you has no value? What value do I have now? Victoria's voice cracked slightly. I can't work in my father's business like I planned. I can't dance. I can't even go to the bathroom by myself. I'm completely dependent on others for everything. Grace was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was firm but kind. My Sarah was studying to be a teacher. She wanted to change the world through education. When she died, I thought all that intelligence and passion was wasted. But then I realized something. She had already changed the world by changing me. Her kindness, her dreams, her way of seeing people's potential had made me a better person. That didn't die with her. Victoria felt tears starting to form in her eyes, the first tears she had shed in months. But I feel so empty. Like everything that made me who I was is gone. Everything that made you who you are is still here, Grace said gently, placing her hand over Victoria's heart. Your mind, your compassion, your strength, none of that was in your legs. For the first time in months, Victoria felt a tiny crack in the wall of despair she had built around herself. It wasn't hope exactly, but it wasn't complete darkness either. I don't know how to live like this, Victoria whispered. You don't have to know how to live the rest of your life, Grace replied. You just have to know how to live today. And then, tomorrow, you figure out how to live that day. One day at a time. Grace reached into her bag and pulled out a worn paperback book. This belonged to Sarah. It's a collection of stories about people who overcame incredible challenges. Not fairy tales about magical recoveries, but real stories about real people who found ways to build meaningful lives despite their circumstances. Victoria took the book with trembling hands. The cover was faded, and many pages were marked with careful notes in the margins. Why are you giving this to me? Because Sarah would have wanted you to have it. She believed that every person has the power to impact the world in ways they can't even imagine. Sometimes we just need to find a new way to use that power. Victoria looked down at the book, then back at Grace. Victoria woke earlier than she had in months, a strange sense of anticipation stirring in her chest. Sunlight was just beginning to creep across her bedroom floor, and she could hear Grace moving quietly in the adjoining sitting room, preparing for the day. The book Grace had given her lay on the nightstand, waiting. Good morning, Victoria, Grace said warmly as she entered with a breakfast tray. You're up early today. I couldn't sleep much, Victoria admitted. I kept thinking about what you said yesterday, about your daughter, and about purpose. Grace set the tray down and helped Victoria sit up properly in bed. What were you thinking about specifically? Victoria gestured toward the book. Before the accident, I thought I knew exactly what my life would be. I was going to graduate, work with my father, maybe run the company someday. Now all of that seems impossible. But you talked about finding new ways to use our power to impact the world. I don't understand what that means for someone like me. Grace settled into the chair beside the bed. Let's start with Sarah's book and see what we discover. She opened to the first story, about a young man who had lost both arms in a farming accident but went on to become a renowned artist using his feet and mouth to paint. Victoria listened intently as Grace read, not just to the words but to the way Grace's voice carried both sadness and pride when she mentioned how Sarah had highlighted certain passages. "Sarah wrote notes here," Grace said, showing Victoria the margins filled with neat handwriting. She wrote, "Limitations only define us if we let them." This man didn't find a way around his disability. He found a way to make his disability irrelevant to his art. Victoria studied the notes carefully. She was very thoughtful. She was always looking for the deeper meaning in things. Grace turned the page. This next story was one of her favorites. It's about a woman who became paralyzed in a diving accident and went on to become a lawyer specializing in disability rights. As Grace read, Victoria found herself genuinely engaged for the first time in months. The woman in the story had faced many of the same physical challenges Victoria was dealing with, but had channeled her experience into helping others navigate legal barriers that discriminated against people with disabilities. She started with just one case, Grace read, a local business that refused to install wheelchair ramps. She researched the law, filed the complaint herself, and won. That single victory led to bigger cases, and eventually she argued before the Supreme Court. Victoria was quiet for a long time after Grace finished reading. Do you think she was angry at first? Like I am. Sarah highlighted this part, Grace said, pointing to a paragraph. The woman said she spent the first year after her accident feeling like her life was over. She said the anger was like a fire that either burns you up or gives you energy to forge something new. "I feel burned up," Victoria said honestly. "I don't feel like I have energy for anything." Grace closed the book gently. That's okay. Anger is exhausting when it has nowhere to go. But sometimes, when we find the right direction for it, it becomes fuel instead of poison. Over the following days, Grace and Victoria established a new routine. Each morning, Grace would read a story from Sarah's book, and they would discuss it. Victoria began to ask more questions, not just about the people in the stories, but about Grace's life and experiences. Grace shared stories about other people she had cared for over the years. There was Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman with dementia who had taught Grace patience and the importance of living in the present moment. There was Marcus, a teenager with muscular dystrophy who had dreams of becoming a filmmaker and had taught Grace about the power of storytelling to change perspectives. Marcus couldn't hold a traditional camera, Grace explained one afternoon as they sat in the garden. But he learned to direct films using adaptive technology. He made a documentary about life with disabilities that changed how his entire school district approached accessibility. Victoria was beginning to venture outside her room more often. At first, it was just to the garden with Grace, but gradually she began joining her parents for meals again, and even spending time in her father's study, a room she had always loved for its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the view of the city skyline. One evening, about 2 weeks after Grace's arrival, Victoria made a significant decision. "Grace, I want to try something." "What's that, child?" "I want to use the computer in my father's study. I want to research something." Grace smiled. "What do you want to research?" Victoria hesitated, then spoke with more determination than she had shown in months. "I want to learn about accessibility in buildings, about the laws that woman in the book used to fight discrimination." That night, with Grace's help, Victoria sat up at her father's computer. Her fingers felt clumsy on the keyboard at first. She hadn't used a computer since before the accident, but gradually she found her rhythm. She spent hours reading about the Americans with Disabilities Act, about accessibility standards, about the legal battles that had been fought to ensure equal access for people with disabilities. What she discovered shocked her. Despite laws that had been in place for decades, many buildings, especially older ones, remained completely inaccessible. She read story after story of people who couldn't attend school board meetings, couldn't enter restaurants, couldn't access their own workplace buildings because of architectural barriers. "Grace," she said the next morning, excitement creeping into her voice for the first time in months. "Did you know that less than half of the small businesses in our city are fully accessible to wheelchairs?" Grace smiled at the energy in Victoria's voice. "No, I didn't know that. What else did you learn?" Victoria had filled several pages with notes. "There are laws, but enforcement is inconsistent. Most of the time, nothing happens unless someone files a complaint. And most people with disabilities don't know their rights or don't have the resources to fight. Over the next few days, Victoria threw herself into research with an intensity that surprised everyone. She studied accessibility law, building codes, and the experiences of people with disabilities in their community. She reached out to disability advocacy groups online and began to understand the scope of the challenges faced by people like her. Victoria, her father, Robert Sterling, said one evening when he found her working late in his study, "Your mother tells me you've been spending a lot of time researching. What's captured your interest?" Victoria looked up from her notes, her eyes bright with purpose for the first time since the accident. "Dad, did you know that Sterling Enterprises owns 12 buildings in the downtown area that aren't fully accessible?" Robert was surprised by both the question and the focused energy in his daughter's voice. I hadn't thought about it. Our newer buildings meet all current codes, but some of the older properties." He trailed off, realizing he had never considered this issue seriously. "It's not just about meeting codes," Victoria continued, her voice gaining strength. "It's about whether people like me can actually participate in society. Can we attend business meetings, go to restaurants, shop in stores, attend public events?" Right now, the answer is often no. Robert sat down across from his daughter, seeing a glimpse of the passionate young woman she had been before the accident. "What are you thinking?" Victoria took a deep breath. "I'm thinking that Sterling Enterprises could lead by example, not just in making our own buildings accessible, but in showing other businesses how it can be done well. And I'm thinking that maybe I could be involved in that effort." "Victoria," her mother said from the doorway, where she had been listening with tears in her eyes, "that sounds like an incredible project." Victoria turned to include her mother in the conversation. "Grace has been helping me understand that having value doesn't mean doing things the same way I used to. Maybe I can't work in the business the way I originally planned, but maybe there's a different way I can contribute." That weekend, Victoria asked Grace to accompany her on her first venture outside the house since the accident. They visited 3 Sterling Enterprises properties downtown, with Victoria taking careful notes about accessibility challenges and opportunities for improvement. At the first building, an office complex built in the 1980s, Victoria discovered that while there was a ramp at the main entrance, the elevator buttons were positioned too high for someone in a wheelchair to reach comfortably. The bathroom stalls were technically wide enough to meet code, but maneuvering a wheelchair inside them was nearly impossible. "It's like they checked boxes without thinking about whether someone could actually use the space," Victoria told Grace as they made their observations. At the second building, a retail center, they found that several shops had steps at their entrances, making them completely inaccessible. The ones that were technically accessible had clothing racks placed so close together that navigating in a wheelchair was frustrating and embarrassing. But it was at the third building, a recently renovated hotel, where Victoria had an epiphany. This property had been designed with genuine accessibility in mind. The entrances were graceful and welcoming, the elevator controls were positioned thoughtfully, and the public spaces were designed so that people with disabilities could move through them with dignity and ease. "This is beautiful," Victoria said as they explored the hotel's public areas. "It's not just accessible, it's inclusively designed. Someone thought about how to make this space welcoming for everyone." Grace watched Victoria's face light up as she examined the thoughtful design details. "You're seeing possibilities now, aren't you?" Victoria nodded, her mind racing with ideas. "I'm seeing that accessibility doesn't have to be an afterthought or something that makes buildings ugly or expensive. When it's done right, it makes spaces better for everyone." That evening, Victoria asked her parents to join her in the study. She had prepared a presentation using her father's computer, something she hadn't done since before the accident. "I want to propose something," she began, her voice steady with newfound confidence. "I want Sterling Enterprises to become the leading example of inclusive design in our city. Not just meeting accessibility requirements, but exceeding them in ways that show other businesses what's possible." She walked them through her research, showing examples of excellent inclusive design from around the world, explaining the business benefits of accessibility, and outlining the social impact such an initiative could have. "This isn't just about following laws," Victoria explained. It's about recognizing that 12% of our population has some form of disability, and they represent enormous economic potential that most businesses are ignoring. Robert and Eleanor listened with growing amazement as their daughter presented ideas with the passion and intelligence they remembered from before the accident, but with a depth of understanding and purpose that seemed new. "Victoria, this is remarkable," Robert said when she finished. "You've clearly done extensive research. But are you sure you want to take this on? It would be a major commitment." Victoria looked at Grace, who smiled encouragingly, then back at her parents. "For months, I felt like my life was over because I couldn't do what I had originally planned. But Grace helped me understand that sometimes the most meaningful work comes from experiences we never wanted to have. My accident gave me insight into challenges I never would have understood before. Maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe it's an opportunity." Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes. "Darling, seeing you passionate about something again, it's the most beautiful thing I could imagine." 6 months after Grace's arrival, Victoria Sterling was a completely different person. The defeated young woman who had stared hopelessly out windows had been replaced by someone with fire in her eyes and purpose in every movement. Today marked a milestone she had never imagined possible: the grand opening of the Sterling Center for Inclusive Design, the first project in her accessibility initiative. Victoria moved through the crowd of business leaders, disability advocates, and media representatives with Grace beside her, both women radiating quiet pride. The transformed office building showcased everything Victoria had learned about inclusive design: wide, welcoming entrances with automatic doors, reception areas with multiple height options, braille and large print signage throughout, and elevator controls positioned for universal access. "Miss Sterling," a reporter approached with her cameraman. "This building renovation reportedly cost 30% more than a standard upgrade. How do you justify that expense?" Victoria smiled confidently, her media training serving her well. "That's actually a common misconception. While our initial investment was higher, studies show that inclusive design increases property values, reduces long-term modification costs, and expands the potential customer and employee base significantly. But beyond the numbers, the question we should be asking is, what's the cost of excluding 12% of our population from participating fully in society?" Grace watched with amazement as Victoria fielded questions with expertise and passion. The transformation had been gradual but profound. Victoria had spent months studying not just accessibility law and design principles, but also working directly with people in the disability community to understand their daily challenges. Victoria called James Chun, a wheelchair user and disability rights lawyer who had become both a consultant and friend on the project. "The tour group is ready for you." Victoria nodded and addressed the gathered crowd. "Today isn't just about opening one accessible building. It's about proving that inclusive design is smart business and good citizenship. I'd like to invite you all to experience this space as we tour it together." As the group moved through the building, Victoria pointed out design features that demonstrated thoughtful accessibility. In the conference rooms, she showed how tables at varying heights allowed wheelchair users and standing participants to meet as equals. The bathrooms included not just accessible stalls, but also adult-sized changing tables for people with more complex needs. "Every choice we made was informed by the disability community," Victoria explained as they visited the employee break room. "The counter heights, the cabinet pulls, the lighting levels, all designed so that people of different abilities can work together seamlessly." Grace noticed how Victoria naturally included stories from the people she had interviewed during her research. She talked about Maria, a lawyer who had left her firm because she couldn't reach the files in their law library. She mentioned David, an accountant whose brilliant analytical mind was overlooked by employers who focused on his speech disability. These weren't just design problems to Victoria, they were human stories that demanded solutions. After the tour, the crowd moved to the building's community room for the dedication ceremony. Victoria had insisted that people with disabilities be centered in the event, not just included as an afterthought. "Before I speak about what this project means," Victoria began, addressing the assembled crowd from behind a podium adjusted to accommodate speakers of different heights. I want to acknowledge someone whose guidance made everything possible." She turned toward Grace, who was seated in the front row. Grace Washington came into my life when I had lost all hope. She taught me that our greatest challenges can become our greatest sources of strength. "Grace, would you please join me?" Grace was surprised, but moved gracefully to the front of the room. Victoria continued. Grace's daughter Sarah believed that every person has the power to change the world. Through Grace's wisdom and Sarah's legacy, I learned that my accident didn't end my ability to make a difference. It gave me a new and deeper way to contribute. The audience applauded as Grace smiled warmly at Victoria. Victoria then addressed the crowd with a speech that had been months in the making. 8 months ago, I thought my life was over. I believed that because I could no longer walk, I could no longer contribute. I was wrong. Disability gave me perspective I never could have gained otherwise. It taught me that barriers aren't just inconveniences, they're injustices. And it showed me that removing barriers doesn't just help people with disabilities, it creates better spaces for everyone. She gestured around the beautiful room. This building has features that help people with disabilities, but also parents with strollers, delivery workers with heavy equipment, elderly visitors, and anyone who might be temporarily injured. Inclusive design is simply good design. Victoria paused, looking out at faces that included many people she had met during her research, individuals who had shared their stories and helped shape her understanding. But this project isn't just about buildings. Sterling Enterprises is launching a comprehensive initiative to change how our community thinks about accessibility. We're providing grants for small businesses to improve accessibility. We're partnering with the school district to ensure all students can participate fully in their education. And we're creating internship and employment programs that tap into the incredible talent pool of people with disabilities who are too often overlooked. The applause was enthusiastic, but Victoria raised her hand to continue. Most importantly, we're proving that leadership isn't about avoiding challenges. It's about facing them and finding solutions that benefit everyone. I challenge every business leader here today to look at your own buildings, your own practices, and ask, are we including everyone, or are we leaving potential behind? As the formal ceremony concluded, Victoria found herself surrounded by people wanting to discuss partnerships, ask questions, or simply thank her for her work. Grace watched from nearby, marveling at how this young woman had channeled her pain into purpose. "Victoria," a voice called out. She turned to see Dr. Anderson, the rehabilitation specialist who had tried to work with her months earlier. "I wanted to apologize for giving up on you, and to say how incredibly proud I am of what you've accomplished." Victoria smiled genuinely. "You didn't give up on me, Dr. Anderson. I gave up on myself. But I learned that recovery doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it means building something entirely new." Later that evening, back at the Sterling mansion, Victoria and Grace sat in the same garden where they had first begun to talk about finding purpose beyond pain. Victoria was exhausted, but exhilarated, her laptop open as she responded to emails from potential partners and collaborators. "Grace," Victoria said, looking up from her computer, "I have something to tell you." Grace looked up from the knitting she had taken up to keep her hands busy during Victoria's long work sessions. "The University of Chicago has invited me to speak at their Graduate School of Business about inclusive design and social entrepreneurship. They want to explore creating a formal program around these concepts." Grace smiled widely. "That's wonderful, child. You've become quite the teacher yourself." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I've also been thinking about something else. I want to establish a scholarship program for students with disabilities who want to study business or social innovation. I want to call it the Sarah Washington Scholarship for Inclusive Leadership." Grace set down her knitting, tears forming in her eyes. "Victoria, that's beautiful. Sarah would be so honored." "She should be honored," Victoria said firmly. Her belief in human potential started all of this. Her notes in that book showed me that limitations don't have to define us. And your willingness to share her story with me changed everything. Grace wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. "You know, when Sarah died, I thought her dreams of changing the world through education had died with her. But sitting here, watching you teach business leaders and students and community members about inclusion and justice, I think her dreams are very much alive." Victoria reached over and took Grace's hand. Grace, I want you to know that you saved my life. Not just by helping me find purpose, but by showing me that even in our darkest moments, we can still be sources of light for others. Grace squeezed Victoria's hand. Child, you saved mine too. Watching you transform your pain into power, seeing you fight for others, it reminded me that Sarah's spirit lives on in every person who chooses to make the world more just and inclusive. As the months passed, Victoria's work expanded beyond anyone's expectations. The Sterling Center for Inclusive Design became a model studied by architects and business leaders across the country. Victoria traveled to conferences, consulted on major projects, and worked with lawmakers to strengthen accessibility regulations. But, perhaps more importantly, she had become a bridge between the disability community and the business world, translating experiences into policies and transforming attitudes through personal relationships. 1 year after Grace's arrival, Victoria received a letter that moved her to tears. It was from a young man named Michael who had been born with cerebral palsy. He wrote about how seeing Victoria's work had inspired him to pursue his own dreams of becoming an architect specializing in accessible design. He had applied for the Sarah Washington Scholarship and wanted to thank Victoria for showing him that his disability could be a source of insight rather than limitation. Grace, Victoria said that evening, I understand now what you meant about ripples we can't see. Michael's letter made me realize that every person we inspire to see their challenges as sources of strength will go on to help others see the same thing. Grace nodded, her own face glowing with pride. That's exactly what Sarah believed. She used to say that teaching wasn't about filling empty vessels with knowledge. It was about lighting fires that would spread from person to person. Victoria looked around her father's study, now transformed into a command center for her accessibility work. The walls were covered with architectural plans, photos from building openings, letters from people whose lives had been touched by her work, and, prominently displayed, the original book Grace had given her with Sarah's thoughtful notes still visible in the margins. I've been thinking, Victoria said, about writing a book of my own. Not about overcoming disability, but about how including people with disabilities makes everything better. About how diversity of ability leads to innovation that benefits everyone. Grace smiled. I think that's exactly the kind of book Sarah would have wanted to read. Victoria nodded, already envisioning the stories she would tell and the lessons she had learned. I want to call it Beyond Barriers, how inclusive design creates a better world for everyone. And, Grace, I want you to help me write it. Your wisdom and Sarah's insights need to be part of the story. As Victoria continued planning her next projects, a design fellowship program, a national conference on accessible tourism, partnerships with major corporations, Grace marveled at the transformation that had taken place. The hopeless young woman who had refused to engage with life had become a national advocate whose work was changing how society thought about ability and inclusion. But what struck Grace most was not just Victoria's professional success, but the joy that had returned to her life. Victoria laughed often now, surrounded herself with friends from the disability community and beyond, and approached each day with curiosity and purpose. She had not just survived her accident. She had used it as a foundation to build something beautiful and meaningful. Grace, Victoria said one evening as they sat together in the garden, now designed with accessible pathways and raised beds that could be enjoyed by people of all abilities. Do you think Sarah would be proud of how her book helped change my life? Grace looked at the young woman who had become like a daughter to her, then up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Child, Grace said softly, I think Sarah is proud of how you used her book to change the world. And I think she's especially proud that her legacy lives on in someone who understands that true strength comes not from avoiding difficulties, but from transforming them into opportunities to serve others. Victoria smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace and purpose that she had never imagined possible during those dark months after her accident. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to fight for inclusion and justice. But tonight, she was simply grateful for Grace's wisdom, for Sarah's inspiration, and for the unexpected gift of discovering that her greatest limitation had become her most powerful source of strength. In the distance, the lights of the city twinkled like possibilities, and Victoria Sterling knew that her real work was just beginning. "Grace," Victoria said, turning to the woman who had become so much more than a caregiver. "Will you help me with this project? I'll need someone who understands both the practical challenges and the human aspects of what we're trying to accomplish." Grace smiled, and Victoria saw in her eyes the same pride she imagined Grace had once felt watching Sarah pursue her dreams of teaching. "Child," Grace said, "I think Sarah would be very proud to see how her book is still teaching people. And I would be honored to help you change the world, one building at a time." As Victoria fell asleep that night, she realized that for the first time since the accident, she was excited about tomorrow. She had found a new way to use her mind, her family's resources, and even her disability to make a meaningful difference. The future looked completely different from what she had planned, but it looked bright again. Will you stay? Not to fix me or make me do exercises. Just to stay." Grace smiled, and for the first time in months, Victoria saw genuine warmth directed at her without pity or false cheer. "I'll stay as long as you need me, child." As the afternoon wore on, Grace simply sat with Victoria in comfortable silence. Occasionally, she would comment on something happening in the gardens or share a quiet observation about the beautiful architecture of the room. She didn't try to motivate Victoria or push her toward any activities. She simply provided a peaceful presence that Victoria hadn't realized she desperately needed. When evening approached, Grace helped Victoria get ready for dinner. Unlike the previous caregivers who had handled these tasks with clinical efficiency, Grace worked with gentle dignity, chatting casually about small things while helping Victoria transfer to her regular chair at the dining table. "Grace," Victoria said as they made their way to the dining room, "what you said about your daughter, about her still changing the world through how she changed you. Do you really believe that?" Grace paused in the hallway, considering the question seriously. "I do. Every person we meet, every kindness we show, every moment we choose to keep going despite our pain, it all ripples out in ways we can't see." Sarah's dreams of teaching may have ended, but her belief in human potential lives on in how I try to help others. Victoria nodded slowly. It was the first time in months that anyone had spoken to her about purpose without making it sound like a burden or an impossible goal. That night, as Grace helped Victoria prepare for bed, Victoria made a decision. "Tomorrow, will you read to me from Sarah's book?" "I'd be honored to," Grace replied. For the first time since the accident, Victoria fell asleep without the crushing weight of complete hopelessness pressing down on her chest. She didn't feel hope yet, but she felt something else, a quiet curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. It wasn't much, but for Victoria Sterling, it was the beginning of everything.